Hi, so I'm Dave, and I thought we'd each of us talk a little bit about what brings us to the to this particular COE and to the internet community in general. I research IoT and systems for smart grids and virtual power plants. At least that's what I'm doing currently. But I also have an interest in the healthcare industry and a hobby interest in home IoT. Evelyn, do you want to talk a little bit about why you're here?
Yes, so my passion and my professional focus is privacy. I've had my head up in the clouds for some time now. I feel very strongly about the need to empower individuals over their data, and also for privacy to be much more linked with security as we move forward in developing standards and considerations for privacy in IoT.
George?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Evelyn. My name is George Young. I work for CBT. Our company spends a lot of time and has a lot of experience regarding working in the IoT field, specifically industrial IoT. We've done a lot of work for quite a few years now, where we have operational sites in the industrial area, specifically oil and gas at the moment. And so developing, implementing those is really key to what we're doing as an organization. I would also say, for me as a cybersecurity guy, that the security element of bridging IoT and OT is really of interest to me and our organization, and how that is emerging and the things that are being put in place today. We have a way to go, but that's the reason for my interest, and my organization's interest is to support, help, and learn along the way regarding the IoT, and specifically industrial IoT.
Great, thanks very much, George. So this is the charter, if you will, for the Security, Privacy, and Trust Center of Excellence. Much of it centered on creating awareness and advocating security and privacy by design. As we've probably all heard, security and privacy are kind of like the lost children of the internet, have been for quite a long time. And we know that with the stakes that we see in IoT, and specifically in the integration with things like cyber physical systems, where consequences have physical consequences, then we know we have to practice security and privacy by design. Also want to invite people to go to iotpractitioner.com to see some of what's going on in this area. This is a set of proposed areas of focus for this particular Center of Excellence. I won't go through this, but a lot is involved here, and a lot of this has to do with interactions, I think, with other areas in the IoT community, such as I know there are centers of excellence focusing on things like digital twins and interaction models, basically use cases for systems of IoT, virtual devices, composite devices, all of those kinds of things. And there's also a big issue that we're focusing on in legacy devices. That's always in the adoption of any new set of global standards. Legacy devices generally get involved in a lot of complexity, and so we need strategies for some of those things. But in any case, I think what we should do is let's just get into it and start talking about a few questions. Many of us have heard customers and clients talk about some of the security, privacy, and trust issues, and about standards and regulations, and many people really don't know where to begin. I've had recent clients, partners who are in a virtual power plant business are wanting to integrate VPPs. And they've got devices. They want to be able to integrate them into a much more proactive system, a much more responsive system. But even things like identifying those devices, understanding what their capabilities are, where the data goes that they collect, all of those kinds of things. There aren't any standards, and there's hardly any prior art, so to speak, to go by, but there's a lot of opportunity. Let's start maybe with the positives. The IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 was a landmark accomplishment for the IoT industry. George, what was the impact of this legislation on the industry, and what has occurred since it's passed, and where are we going to go from here?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so the act itself was really planting a flag in the ground. It was a much needed legislation. It really it specifically deals with the federal government, as most standards come out, right? I mean, you can go back in the old days of TCP/IP and Ethernet and all that kind of stuff like that, the OSI model. But really, it's a way to bring together a standard, an open environment where manufacturers, as they work with the federal government in this case, can develop standards, and then we can move towards an area where we can better serve our customers, our clients, with security and privacy with the technology that's in place, everybody marching towards a single point, if you will. There's other organizations or other standards out there that at the state level, California and Oregon, they propose some, or actually they've got some laws on the books right now regarding that. I think it's one of those things where the legislature is trying to catch up to the technology, and specifically dealing with, like I said before, in our area with CBT, we deal with the industrial side. So now you're talking about operational technology, something that's been in place for years prior to this whole cybersecurity issue coming into play. Now with the merging of those two, it's really significant right now because lives are at stake regarding just simply an IT infrastructure. So I think really, what's nice about the legislature of the 2020 Act is that it's not just a standard or static piece of documentation. So what I mean by that is that every 5 years they have to review this. And I like that concept where the bill gives the freedom to evolve. And I think that's really, really key, especially in the technology field where we're going right now, because as you guys well know, every 5 years, oh my God, technology changes so quickly. But I think really it's one of those things where it's really important that we have a working towards a common goal so that we can, protect the infrastructures that are out there. And really the number one goal is safety and privacy. Those are the two goals, if you will. But where we're going right now, I would say I would not be surprised to see further legislation down the road. You see some happening right now with the 8259, which I'm sure we're going to touch on a little bit later on, where it gets into more of the technical aspect of it, which is really, really important. But I think you're going to see more of a broadening of that, and some specifics are needed. Right now, it's a great overview framework, if you will, but the specifics, the devil's in the details, if you will.
Right. Evelyn, do you want to chime in a little bit on the Cybersecurity Act and how you see it for privacy and other aspects?
Thanks so much, David and George. Yeah, so building on what George said, I do also like the fact that this gets, reviewed every 5 years. I think one of the common themes I'm seeing with cybersecurity regulation is that a lot of it still remains very infrastructure driven. And today, in a data-driven world, where data is essentially fueling so much of what we do, especially in this industrial IoT context, That's the direction I feel like we have an opportunity to be headed with standards. Also, the second point that I kind of feel quite strongly about is that quite often the standard makers and technologists sit on opposite sides of the fence. And quite often we see with them, an ever-growing number of legislation and new frameworks, is that they dovetail and intersect with each other, and sometimes they contradict each other, which makes it very problematic for the implementers of these. So I'm looking forward to greater harmonization in that space.
Oh, great. So one of the things that I saw in the Act was specific directions to NIST and other agencies, but NIST in particular, with respect to setting up, obviously, standards for security. What has happened is that NIST has provided, I think, some very good guidelines for the kind of capabilities that IoT devices should have in order to ensure safety, privacy, and security. But the problem is that those specific guidelines so far don't address any of the issues that are really gnarly, including things like interoperability and something we mentioned earlier, such as legacy devices. A lot of the devices out there, and the term has sort of disappeared a little bit, the trillions of sensors. It was a kind of a movement a while ago, but there are trillions of sensors now, and those devices are IoT devices. They get integrated into these systems. How do we treat them from a security, privacy, and trust point of view? And I think privacy is actually one of the really biggest issues, obviously, with sensor devices. So we've got to start, at least, with the Cybersecurity Act, and there are people who are responding and providing, I think, some good guidance, but they're just baseline capabilities that we're talking about, no standard ways for providing them, and no practical interoperability. There are places where I think that we've seen proposals not broadly implemented, but for machine-to-machine interaction and things of that sort. But if you take a look at the capabilities that NIST is promoting right now, they go way beyond machine-to-machine interaction. And to their credit, they have an emphasis on systems, not just interactions between one machine and another, but systems of devices, and how those systems need to be secured and how those systems pass data amongst the different elements. George, since there are no current global IoT security standards in place for manufacturers to abide by, what actions might different people, different organizations, and for that matter, consumers, insist on to protect themselves until we get some of those standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yesterday, Julian from your organization, Intertrust, did a really fantastic job in laying out some of the steps that you could take to mitigate the issues, if you will. There's different scenarios regarding the enterprise or industrial versus the consumer side, right? I mean, there's from a legal standpoint, the whole liability thing on the enterprise side. So you have to take these extra steps to make sure, but that you're protected not only for your organizational shareholders and such, but it's really, I'll speak from an enterprise standpoint. It's really the idea of, first of all, you need to make sure that you have an idea, what do you have? An inventory of the items themselves, because we get into an area of the unknown. As we know, sometimes devices or items show up unexpectedly on a infrastructure, and you're like, what the heck is that? And then why are we having a problem with this particular area or device that shouldn't even be on our network? So an inventory of the network is key. Understanding what do you have itself. So identifying the device, itself, being able to the authentication and authorization of those devices, everything. here's the issue with IoT devices. Some of them have the capability of putting software on them, and you can patch them, which patching is really key and to making sure that you're up to date. I can't tell you how many times that the issue that that organizations have is because they haven't had a policy or procedure regarding staying current with their patching and the updates themselves. But as you say, legacy items, legacy IoT devices, sometimes they don't have the intelligence where you can do the patching. So you run into that, kind of stare. Now, on the industrial, on the OT side, you've got protocols. So you've got different protocols that are out there. And so how do you mitigate that? Really, the obstacle there is all these different protocols, but there's ways to do that, and we can touch upon that maybe a little bit later. But protecting the data, is key. You gather the data from these sensors. What do you do with the data in transit? Is it encrypted? How's it stored? How's it stored at rest? Those are important elements that you need to make sure that the data is not only secure, but is it valid? Has it been touched? Has there been a man-in-the-middle attack? So you need to make sure you have mitigation issues. The other thing too is to take into account is like, assume that you will have a breach, which is a terrible thought, but what mitigations have you taken to remediate the issue? Have you done backups? What have you done with the data? How far back can you go? If there is a attack like Colonial Pipeline, I mean, do you have a backup systems in place? Do you have the information stored, where you have a timestamp that you can go back to and rely on to make sure that, you only lost so much data. So you have to be careful about that. And then there's the, getting into security or privacy, which is Evelyn's area of expertise, is like in a hospital environment, HIPAA. You have to be concerned about that, patients' records and things. So there's a lot that you have to take into account, and there's different ways that you can mitigate it. One of the big, areas right now is zero trust. Don't trust until you verify. And so I think that's really key to, how you go about it and taking steps to make sure that you can authenticate, authorize the data, the sensors, the information that's coming in, because the information will flow. But if somebody compromised that IoT device in the beginning and they're part of the flow, traffic flow, you still have bad data coming through. You have the area you have been, the visit, the item, if you will, the sensor has been, the vulnerability, if you will, has been exploited. And so you get into an area, well, they're already inside the network, and then you have a problem.
Yeah, you bring up zero trust, and that's an area that I found has really confused a lot of people. I think actually it's a bad term to use, although in the right context, it's perfect. And that is the context of not relying on, not trusting the network. So you make your security system and your privacy by design independent of the network configuration, independent of, in fact, you don't even know what networks devices are connected to anymore. So it's almost impossible to analyze. So we don't have any choice than to design systems whose security and privacy are independent of the network. But it's not really zero trust is what you get. You still have to rely on all kinds of things. And a little later on, maybe we can discuss about the human factors aspect of all of this. How do people actually know what they're relying on and what they aren't relying on?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you get into the whole, the concept of depth and, defense in depth, if you will, kind of like the layered approach. Configurations of these devices, are they validated? Has anything changed? It's one of those things where, as a security guy, I look everything from a paranoid point of view, and that's where I start. And that's for me, zero trust takes on that kind of a meaning itself, but your points are valid.
Yeah. So, Evelyn, how do users feel about the fact that approximately, by some estimates, 150 million discrete data points are maybe collected about them daily, to sort of get the focus back on people again? From a security perspective, how does this create more points for hackers, and how can people understand what is happening to all of this data? That's an area that I know you're really concerned about.
So, you know, it's an interesting thing because before George brought up this idea, you know, about inventorying what's on your network. And as part of, you know, a privacy impact assessment that, you know, at the time, you know, an organization is looking to deploy IoT or, you know, make significant changes in the way they're set up. One of the things I think a critical step is the inventorying of data. You know, what types of data, you know, are being collected? How are they being correlated against each other? And, you know, looking at the flow and touch points, mapping out those APIs is a critical thing, which, you know, both has strong, done correctly, I think it provides strong privacy protection as well as security protection. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the interesting things is, you know, when I look at IoT in an industrial context and the way it may expose individuals, I'm going to use this, you know, just example. So take as an example, someone working in an industrial context and they are operating some machinery. So some correlation is done against them to figure out the likelihood that they might have a heart attack or have some sort of physical injury or ailment in their role operating critical machinery. That has very strong, what I call profiling connotations. And that's where some individuals might become very concerned about, you know, does it mean that now I'm being profiled as being in a high risk factor? And will that also have other spin-off effects? May it affect my insurance premiums down the line? Mm-hmm. Or if, you know, you're someone who's a consumer of an industrial IoT and you have, you know, there's data floating out about you about your usage of certain types of resources. And that, you know, becomes a way that you might be identified as being in a certain geography, being of a certain age group, you know, and targeted for in other ways that you may have not expected. One of the things that people can do about this is today, one of the things that I think is working very well with regulations is giving end users the opportunity to exercise their right to be forgotten, their right to data portability, their right to know what an organization is collecting about them. And I think that this is something, it's probably a longer topic than now, so I'm just going to skim past it, but this is something that, you know, maybe in a future session we could dive into about how this can provide greater transparency for end users in an IoT context.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think we should do that. And I'd also add that in terms of creating awareness, we get anecdotes periodically, and the regulators sometimes even respond to some of these, you know, more egregious anecdotes. You know, one of the books I like and recommend in this area is Bruce Schneier's book, provocatively entitled "Click Here to Kill Everybody," and he talks about his course at Harvard when he uses a doll. I think it's named My Friend Kayla, and he invites people from the audience. Typically, a lot of them are actually technology naive, and to start hacking the doll from their seats, and just gives them a few hints. And it turns out that, you know, the Bluetooth interface is wide open, and you can easily just establish a connection from your phone and see everything that the doll senses, video, audio, etc. A neighbor can do that, etc. That led to, you know, this particular toy being banned. Regulatory body, I've forgotten which one actually has banned it. But I don't know if there's any systematic way whereby those kinds of things are addressed. Now, sometimes I think there's a more systematic approach to these things. I recently moved from California to, actually now it's 2 years ago, to Pennsylvania. And in signing a contract, a purchase contract, one of the things that was addressed specifically in the purchase contract was, in effect, a cybersecurity clause, recognizing that homes nowadays have all kinds of IoT devices, sensors, and things of that sort connected into them, and at least warning people that there's security cameras that might be all over the place and on the property. You should find out about, or you should have assurance that those kinds of things are disconnected. But again, the problem is that people, you can mandate a lot of these kinds of things, but actually executing them, giving people the savvy to deal with them is not quite there yet. So we've got good intentions, but I think the human-centered trust issue that I'm talking about is still pretty far behind. You've addressed some of the issues with unwanted profiles, Evelyn, and I just talked about some of the regulatory issues that are coming up, and what happens with regulators sometimes is they just say, well, at least put some people on notice. And we all been annoyed incessantly with the cookie. We've got cookies, and you've got to agree to our cookie policy if you want a decent experience on our website. What's your feeling about the issues of terms and conditions, notices, and things of that sort? Is there any way of going beyond that to be more effective without being also too invasive?
It's very interesting you should bring that up. I think that like you said, these pop-ups that pop up, and in some cases, some vendors are forcing you into accepting those rather than giving you the option to decline all, and I do think it is highly invasive. I think we need to move to a model, two things. One is that terms and conditions needs to be more pictorial for end users to be able to better digest what it means. Today, most end users are not necessarily tech savvy, and when they get this, their inclination is just to click whatever it takes to get rid of it so they can get to what they want without really understanding it. The second thing is that I think we're going to have to look, hopefully that this thing of cookies is now, with some of the moves that are in place, is hopefully moving away. But as we move forward to sort of more user authenticated, if you will, consent, it definitely needs to be put into terms which are not 13 or 26 page notices that people must funnel through, but rather something that is expressed in a universal language, which is potentially pictorial, with some wording so that it can be better digested by end users.
Cool. And George, your company specializes in technology with a human touch, and I know you've looked at technologies and solutions for protecting workers, and I noticed we actually have a Q&A in this area right now from Ahab, and who says, typically resources and headcount is not enough. Should this be an IT or an OT function? If it's a OT function, what resources and headcount expected to be added to OT to handle this? How can we, again, more systematically deal with this, particularly in an industrial environment where we want to respect the rights of employees?
Yeah, so I would say there is really, that's one of those questions where you say it depends, right? And so you get into it depends. And that's the answer that everybody hates and doesn't want to hear, right? So really it's about methodology. So within our organization, and it's much more than just a tagline, technology with a human touch. I mean, it's really our charter. It's really our culture within the organization. that was started by our CEO, Kelly Ireland, and it propagates itself throughout the organization, but also it also carries itself very strongly in the when we deal with customers or some organizations that aren't customers, and we'll invest quite a bit of resources even before we start with a solid relationship. And we have a methodology, and our methodology is something we call a quick start, where we get into the world of, since our world is really bridging between IT and OT, and it's really, the cultures are so different and diverse. It's not only the technology, but it's also the individuals, right? You have, I kind of liken it back to the days of IBM versus everybody else, SNA versus TCP/IP. You have this cultural dynamic that's in place that you have to bridge. And back in the day, I had the fortune of working for an organization that was doing interoperability between the different protocols, and so that was quite interesting, dealing not only with the technology but also the people, the culture. So we go through a process of bringing the organizations or these groups together and really looking at their point of views, their job task, what they're responsible for, and coming up to an area where we bridge the gap. There's some thought out there to have an air gap between OT and IT, right? In that regard. Well, some organizations might stick to that, but really there's a convergence that's taking place. And so for in specifically answering the question regarding the OT and the IT resources, I would say this: really use the technology where it makes sense. Use the resources. Really, is it more of an undertaking to add more individuals? Maybe here and there, but really it's a matter of using the technology to provide efficiencies within the organization, so that you can actually take advantage of really what the holy grail is, and that is information. Information's everything. This data, it's key. What do you do with the data? And so, do you use AI, ML to help aggregate that data, analyze that data? Of course you do. But how do you go about it? What resources do you need regarding that? Do you have a team in place that does it? Do you have a data scientist in place that can help you go through that? Do you have organizations that can analyze that data and produce things that make sense to the business? It all ties back to the business. So getting back to my first answer right there, really depends. But I would say this: you need to align your business resources and the technology together where it makes sense.
Cool. I think also what some of the issues around IT and OT convergence, I think there are a few strategies that people are taking. Let's go a little bit beyond some of the human factors issues that I'm actually intensely interested in, because I think again, we're not going to get real secure systems unless people know how to use them and understand what's going on. And there's a lot of technology out there that could help if it's properly coordinated. Some of the things that I think have been somewhat effective in the consumer area with some of the mobile operating system techniques for explicitly controlling interfaces. What app can have access to what aspects, what resources on your mobile phone. People actually use those things, and they're aware of them, and that actually has been one of the more effective introductions of security and privacy that I can recall over 40 years in this business. And that's kind of that approach of explicitly controlling interfaces is one of the approaches that is recommended in what's in some of the work that NIST is doing, and in particular in the 8259A capabilities inventory, where they recommend that every device, you look at all of the different resources and have access control for the interfaces for each of those each of those resources. That's something that, for legacy devices is probably not in the cards. But
yeah, not for a while anyway.
yes, but I think obviously people can start doing those kinds of things. In some ways, you can use a gateway approach for isolating. In a lot of places, that doesn't really work. I like the area of or the approach of using the concept of digital twins as a security device, whereby you have a way in which people can, with the right permissions, can take a look at a set of devices on an operations panel and actually see information that's coming from those devices to a secure point in the cloud, at least to be able to observe what's going on. And that secure point doesn't redistribute information except through, again, very, very explicitly controlled interfaces. At Intertrust, we call these things explicit private networks, where it's not a communications technology kind of approach, but more of the zero trust approach, whereby, again, every explicit interface is accounted for, and every explicit interface has a set of permissions, and also a way of providing a secure connection between those interfaces and the actors who want to act upon them. So
yeah, there's actually on that private network side right now, we haven't even gotten into the whole private 5G, talking about those entry points, right? I mean, that's another discussion for another time. But regarding where you were talking about the use case there, for us, we deal in digital twins, augmented reality, virtual reality ourselves. We have a use case is really in an industrial environment, what we call the connected worker, where there's a headset, if you will, that an individual would use not only for safety biometrics, but also for down worker, but also if they walk up to a sensor or a device, let's say a turbine, if you will, the ability to project information about that, the status of that device itself, but also being projecting back into the control room. So you can possibly have a junior person out there in the field. They're looking at the device. They're communicating backwards to or back to the network operating system, or the control center, I should say. And then you have more of a senior person, and that person could be around the world. They don't have to be like right there on the plant. But securing that communication is really key, but also providing that capability where information is projected to the individual right there at that moment in time. And so you have that mobility of the person or the individual, but also the presentation of the information itself. So we do quite a bit of that.
Yeah. Ellen, in the area of privacy, and we were just talking about, George was in particular talking about having a sort of, you could think of performance aids for people to understand, how things are connected, or when new information is available to them, having notifications that are well directed, those kinds of things. And in the privacy area, do we have those kinds of performance aids, the visuals to really illustrate to people, what's going on, especially with respect to privacy vulnerability?
So, there are a few third-party tools that have developed, which allow you to sort of integrate with a series of APIs. So, for example, let's say if you have some data that you have marked that should not be accessed by the systems, and somehow it accidentally is, that there could be alerting on that, or have data that crosses certain geographic boundaries and that wasn't meant to. You could also have alerting on that. And also just even just specific users, having access, from a role-based access control, but also from a data minimization standpoint, to be able to, put those sorts of controls. So some of the same things that are being for security could also be, if you will, be looked at in a slightly different context, but using the same controls, but just with a slight spin on it, it'd be much more privacy-centric.
Yeah, I think there are some, somewhat, simple things that could be built in. Again, has to do with the whole sort of privacy by design and security by design. I just checked the time. We only have about 3 minutes, and I wanted to ask a question about AI and machine learning and its impact here. And perhaps, George, you could tell us a little bit about your point of view of how those technologies can help us solve some of the problems we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, like I alluded to earlier, and really it's you've got all these entry points and points of information, and so it's really gathering all this information, and really that's one thing. But what do you do with it? How do you massage that information? How do you do you send all the information back to the endpoint, if you will, or the head end, if you or are there technologies that can have edge unit devices that can do a lot of calculations and save a lot of the bandwidth, if you will, and calculations and CPU usage on whether it's either in your data center or in the cloud itself. So really, it's a matter of taking advantage of that. And there are devices out there, and we currently use a couple of them, where, as being a system integrator, where that capability is at the edge, and then it's shared with within the data center itself. But taking that information and applying it is key, because having the information, the key thing is, what do you do with the information now? It's a simplistic statement, but it's really, that's the holy grail. If the information is of not value, then why are we doing this? And sometimes you can have too much information, so it can become murky or cloudy. If you can't dissect that information and use it in an efficient way, there's no use in getting that information. So it's really, once again, it all goes back to the business. How does it help your business, and how does it help the bottom line?
Yeah. Well, in the area of AI, I am seeing that there are a bunch of companies that are emerging that are in the business of collecting a lot of network activity, and extending that out into the IoT space is going to be interesting, because, like I said, there's going to be enormous amounts of data. In fact, there is enormous amounts of data, and it can be made useful. And so I think, what the AI people want to do is they want to take that data to establish normal patterns of behavior, so that they can detect anomalies, security anomalies in particular. But I think we have the hook coming in from Kevin. And we're right at 11:30, and I have to say I really enjoyed this with all of you, and it's been great. Kevin, do you want to wrap us up?